why do you think there is a concern amongst Christians, especially evangelicals, about progressive Christianity?
Well, part of the reason I think is because, frankly, I think there's a lot of misinformation about progressive Christians. So the book that I wrote on this topic, again, Progressive Christians Love Jesus Too, is seeking to provide a response to a book by Alyssa Childers called Another Gospel. In her book, she argues that progressive Christians aren't Christians at all, that they're another religion. She describes them as wolves in shepherd's clothing. She uses the language of saying that they want to kill or eat sheep, God's sheep. So, attributing to progressive Christians the desire to devour faithful Christians and to deceive faithful Christians. This is very incendiary rhetoric. It's very inflammatory. And I think language like that and analysis like that really creates a lot of misinformation and leads Christians to have, I think, very harmful and hurtful views about other Christians. So part of what my concern is to remove what I think is significant misinformation. Now, why? And she's not the only person spreading this kind of what I believe is misinformation. Michael Kruger, he wrote a book. He's a scholar. He's a theologian, but he wrote a book called The 10 Commandments of Progressive Christianity. It's a short booklet, really, but the booklet is based upon a book by a guy named Philip Golly, who doesn't even call himself a progressive Christian. And based upon Golly's book, Michael Kruger argues that there are 10 core beliefs of progressive Christianity when, I mean, there's no agreement among people who are progressive Christians about these 10 views that he attributes to them. So I think it's just unhelpful. Now, I do wonder why conservative evangelicals do things like that. And I think sometimes, because I grew up in the tradition, I know it well. I think sometimes there's just this tendency to want to identify enemies, in part because you're sort of you're raised. I was raised like to look and spot what are the enemies, where's the devil at work, where's the devil trying to deceive us, and sometimes you can end up losing your Christian charity because you're so busy trying to find enemies to identify and call out. Having said that, there's I think another thing that's related to this is there's just often a lot of misunderstanding. For example, one big hallmark of progressive Christians is they'll often talk about the role of doubt. And for the most part, I think what they're doing is when they speak about doubt favorably, is that they're not deriding doctrine and faith and belief, but rather what they're doing is seeking to counterbalance or to redress what is a historic suspicion of doubt within the church, which I think for the most part hasn't been helpful. When Christians have doubts, I don't think that you should stigmatize their doubts. I think you should provide a safe space within the church for them to explore their doubts without fear of censure. And I think that that has been a common concern among progressive Christians. And so when they talk favorably about doubt, I don't think it's because they deride faith as such, but because they want to have room for questioning. And there are several other examples like that where I think there's often a misunderstanding of what progressives are really concerned about. The best thing to address all that is what I already said earlier, which is to just get out and talk to people and find out what their story is and what they actually believe.
Mm-hmm. So I've grown up also, I think, in quite an evangelical kind of environment. I mean, perhaps I've talked to some evangelicals in America, and perhaps my kind of concept of what an evangelical experience might be quite, I would say, perhaps a bit more towards the liberal side, even then, compared to what some of my friends in America tell me about what their evangelical experience is. But perhaps if I had to kind of try to steelman perhaps the evangelical kind of concerns is more so of kind of like they're like there are a few key tenets of Christian faith, and we'll get onto this in a bit, but they'll say that there are a few key tenets of the Christian faith which cannot be changed. For example, maybe sola scriptura, or potentially the Bible is infallible, or Jesus is the Son of God, and there's a Trinity. Like, they'll say that there are a few of these kind of key parts of Christian faith, and they might say, well, progressive Christianity is kind of weakening the belief in these key central faiths. And if progressive Christianity grows, perhaps it might lead people away from these key doctrines of Christian faith. What would be your response or your thoughts on this kind of position?
I mean, I think that's generally accurate what you said. I think one of the dangers is that what can often happen is people end up mistaking or mistaking or conflating their understanding of Christianity with mere Christianity. So, for example, I mentioned Alyssa Childers. One of the things that she does in her book, she says that progressive Christians reject the doctrine of atonement, that they reject the work of Christ. But in fact, what they reject, which I mentioned earlier, is something called the penal substitutionary theory of atonement. This is a specific theoretical framework for understanding how God reconciled the world through Christ, which is that the Father imputed the sins of humanity onto Christ and then imputed Christ's righteousness onto humanity, or credited onto humanity. And through that great exchange, we can be reconciled to the Father, and his wrath against sin is satisfied through the human sacrifice of Jesus. Now, that is a theory, and it's a theory that's been held by many people, particularly since John Calvin, but it's not the gospel. It's a theoretical interpretation of the gospel. So when people like Alyssa Childers say that the critics of penal substitutionary atonement are rejecting the gospel, they've confused theory that is held by evangelicals with mere Christianity, which I think is a real big error. So I think we always have to be careful about that. Now, again, there may be times when people who call themselves progressive Christians do end up throwing out something that is fundamental. I believe, as I said earlier, that the incarnation is fundamental, and that the website progressivechristianity.org undermines the incarnation. So we do have to keep our theological spidey senses tingling and make sure that we are tracking when we find error. But I think we also have to be careful about failing to distinguish our particular conservative evangelical tradition, if that's what we know, with mere Christianity, because rejecting conservative evangelicalism is just not the same thing as rejecting Christianity.